everyone, welcome back to Reads with Reem B. With me, Reem B, and my partner in crime,
Robert.
And today we will be continuing with Oliver Twist. And we will be doing chapters...
Confusion. Definitely
Yeah.
Confusion, because
Because,
this one has the number 9 on it.
yeah, it's a misprint in the book. So I think it's chapters 17 and 18. But I'm never sure.
Yeah, 17 and 18. I had to quickly scroll through to the next chapter to just double check, because Roman numerals.
Yeah. So, that being said, let's begin. Oliver's destiny, continuing unpropitious, brings a great man to London to injure his reputation. It is the custom on stage, in all good murderous melodramas, to present the tragic and comic scenes in regular alternation as the layers of red and white in a side of streaky, well-cured bacon. The hero sinks upon his straw bed, weighed down by the fetters of misfortune, and in the next scene his faithful but unconscious squire regales the audience with a comic song. We behold with throbbing bosoms the heroine in the grasp of a proud and ruthless baron, her virtue and her life alike in danger, drawing forth her dagger to preserve the one at the cost of the other. And, just as our expectations are wrought up to the highest pitch, the whistle is heard, and we are straightway transported to the great hall of the castle, where a grey-headed seneschal sings a funny chorus with a funnier body of vassals who are free of all sorts of places, from church vaults to palaces, to roam about in company, caroling perpetually.
Such changes appear absurd, but they are not so unnatural as they would seem at first sight. The transitions in real life from well-spread boards to deathbeds and from mourning weeds to holiday garments are not at a witless startling. Only there we are busy actors instead of passive lookers-on, which make a vast difference. The actors in the mimic life of the theatre are blind to violent transitions and abrupt impulses of passion or feeling which presented before the eye mere spectators are once condemned as outrageous and preposterous.
As sudden shiftings of the scene, the rapid changes of time and place are not only sanctioned in books by long usage, but are by many considered the great work of authorship. And it's an author's skill in his craft being by such critics chiefly esteemed with relation to the dilemmas in which he leaves his characters at the end of every chapter. This brief introduction to the present may one perhaps be deemed unnecessary. If so, let it be considered a delicate intimation on the part of this historian that he is going back directly to the town in which Oliver Twist was born, the reader taking it for granted that there are good and substantial reasons for making the journey, or he would not be invited to proceed on such an expedition on any account.
Probably the two most paragraphs that have nothing to do with Oliver Twist.
Yeah, we've decided that maybe there was ChatGPT involved.
Mr. Bumble emerged.
No, there really wasn't.
Yep, there wasn't. Mr. Bumble emerged at early morning from the workhouse gate and walked with portly carriage and commanding steps up the high street. He was in the full bloom and pride of beadlehood. His cocked hat and coat were dazzled in the morning sun, and he clutched his cane with vigorous tenacity of health and power. Mr. Bumble always carried his head high, but this morning it was higher than usual. There was a abstraction in his eye, an elevation in his air, which might have warned an observant stranger that thoughts were passing in the beadle's mind, too great for utterance.
Mr. Bumble did not stop to converse with the small shopkeepers and others who spoke to him. Deferentially, as he passed along, he merely returned their salutations with a wave of his hand, and relaxed not his dignified pace until he reached the farm where Miss Mann had attended the infant paupers with parochial care.
Drat that beetle,
Said Miss Mann, hearing the well-known shake at the garden gate.
If it isn't him at this time in the morning, loch, Mr. Bumble, only think of it being you. Well, well, dear me, it is a pleasure that it is. Come into the parlour, sir, please.
The first sentence was addressed to Susan. The exclamation of delights were uttered to Mr. Bumble, as the good lady unlocked the garden gate and showed him in, with great attention and respect, into the house.
Mrs. Mann,
said Mr. Bumble, not sitting upon or dropping himself into a seat, as any common jackanapes would, but letting himself gradually slow down into the chair.
Mrs. Mann, ma'am, good morning.
Well, and a good morning to you, sir,
replied Mrs. Mann with many smiles.
And hoping you find yourself well, sir.
So, Mrs. Mann,
replied the beetle.
A parochial life is not a bed of roses, Mrs. Mann.
Ah, that it isn't indeed, Mr. Bumble,
rejoined the lady, and all the infant puppers might have puppers have chorused and rejoined rejoinder with a great propriety. Big long words are a pain for me with dyslexia.
Yes, we both are dyslexic. This is a very dyslexic channel.
If they had heard it.
A parochial life, ma'am,
continued Mr. Bumble, striking the table with his cane.
It's a life of work and vexation and hardihood, but all public characters, as I may say, may suffer prosecution.
Mrs. Mann, not very well known what the beetle meant, raised her hand with a look of sympathy and sighed.
Ah, you may well sigh, Miss Mann,
said the beetle.
And finding she had done right, Miss Mann sighed again, evidently to the satisfaction of the public character, who, repressing a complacent smile, by looking sternly at his cocked hat, said, Mrs.
Mann, I'm going to London.
Look, Mr. Bumble,
cried Mrs. Mann, starting back.
To London, ma'am,
resumed the inflexible beetle.
By coach, and 2 paupers, Miss Mann. A legal action is a-coming on, about a settlement, and the board has appointed me, Miss Mann, to dispose of the matter before the quarter sessions at Clerkenwell, and I am very much questioned, added
Mr. Bumble, drawing himself up,
whether the Clerkenwell sessions will not find themselves in the wrong box before they have done with me.
Oh, you mustn't to be hard upon them, sir,
said Miss Mann coaxingly.
The Clerkenwell sessions have brought it up upon themselves, ma'am,
replied Mr. Beetle.
If it's the Clerkenwell session find that they come off rather worse than they expected, the Clerkenwell session have only themselves to thank.
There was so much determination and depth of purpose about the menacing manner in which Mr. Bumble delivered these words himself, that Mrs. Mann appeared quite awed by them, and at length she said,
You're going by coach, sir? I thought it was always usual to send them paupers in carts.
That's when they're ill, Miss Mann,
said the beetle.
Well, we put the sick paupers into the open carts in rainy weather to prevent their taking cold. I think that's not
unlogical.
Not to the good of things, really.
God no. Oh,
said Miss Mann.
The opposition coach contracts for these 2 and take them cheap,
said Mr. Bumble.
They are both in a very low state and will find it would come £2 cheaper to move them than bury them. This is if we can throw them upon another parish, which I think I shall be able to do, if they don't die upon the road to spite us.
When Mr. Bumble had laughed a little while, his eyes again encountered the cocked hat, and he became grave.
"We are forgetting business, ma'am,"
said the beetle.
"Here is your parochial stipend for the month."
Mr. Bumble produced some silver money and rolled up in a paper from his pocketbook and requested a receipt, which Miss Mann wrote.
"It's very much bloated, sir."
Blotted. Said the farmer of infants.
"But it's formal enough, I dare say. Thank you, Mr. Bumble, sir. I am very obliged to you, I'm sure."
Mr. Bumble nodded blandly in the acknowledgement of Mrs. Mann's courtesy and inquired who the children were.
We have an interruption by a cat.
Yes, my cat has decided to make himself known. I'm sorry.
Which distracted me to lose my spot. Bless their little hearts.
Yeah, that's where you're at.
Yeah, bless their little hearts,
said Miss Mann with emotion.
"They are as well as can be, the dears, of course, except the two that died last week and little Dick."
"Is that boy no better?"
Inquired Mr. Bumble.
Miss Mann shook her head.
Again, I feel sorry for Dick.
Yeah.
I really do.
Unfortunately, readers, he does pass, I believe.
He's an ill-conditioned, vicious, bad-disposed, parochial child that...
said Mr. Bumble angrily.
"Where is he?"
"I'll bring him to you in 1 minute, sir,"
replied Mrs. Mann.
"Here, you, Dick."
After some cooling, Dick was discovered, having had his face put under the pump and dried upon Mrs. Mann's gown. He was led into the awful presence of Mr. Bumble, the beetle.
The child was pale and thin, his cheeks were sunken, his eyes were large and bright. The scanty Paris dress, the livery of his misery, hung loosely on his feeble body, and his young limbs had wasted away like those of an old man.
Such was the little being who stood trembling beneath Mr. Bumble's glance, not daring to lift his eyes from the floor, and dreading even to hear the beetle's voice.
"Can't you look at the gentleman, you obstinate boy?"
said Mrs. Mann.
The child meekly raised his eyes and encountered those of Mr. Bumble.
"What's the matter with you, parochial Dick?" inquired
Mr. Bumble with a well-timed jocularity.
"Nothing, sir,"
replied the child faintly.
"I should think not," said
Mrs. Mann, who had of course laughed very much at Mr. Bumble's humour.
You want for nothing, I'm sure."
I should like,"
fettered the boy.
"Heyday,"
interposed Mrs. Mann.
"I suppose you're going to say you do want for something now. Why, you little wretch!"
"Stop, Mrs. Mann, stop,"
said the beetle, raising his hand with a show of authority.
"Like what, sir, eh?"
"I should like,"
faltered the child,
"if somebody that can write would put a few words for me down on a piece of paper, and fold it up and seal it and keep it for me, after I'm laid in the ground."
"Why, what does the boy mean?"
exclaimed Mr. Bumble, on whom the earnest manner and wan aspect of the child had made some impression, accustomed as he was to such things.
"What do you mean, sir?"
"I should like,"
said the child,
"to leave my dear love to poor Oliver Twist, and to let him know how often I have sat by myself and cried to think of his wandering about in the dark nights with nobody to help him, and I should like to tell him," said the child,
pressing his small hands together and speaking with a great fervour,
"that I was glad to die when I was very young, for perhaps if I had lived to be a man and had grown old, my little sister, who is in heaven, might forget me, or be unlike me, and it would be so much happier if we were both children there together."
Mr. Bumble surveyed the little speaker from head to foot with indescribable astonishment, and turning to his companions, said, "There's all in one story, Mrs. Mann. That audacious Oliver has demoglized
them all." I couldn't have believed it, sir,"
said Mrs. Mann, holding up her hands to look and looking malignantly at Dick.
"I've never seen such a hardened little wretch."
"Take him away, ma'am,"
said Mr. Bumble imperiously.
This must be stated to the board, Mrs. Mann.
I hope the gentleman will understand it isn't my fault, sir,
said Mrs. Mann, whimpering pathetically.
They shall understand that, ma'am. They shall be acquainted with the true state of the case, said Mr. Bumble. There, take him away. I can't bear the sight of him.
And the cat's about to jump on the table.
Yes, so if the table shakes, it's only because there is a cat on it.
Little sod. Oh my god, cat. Come here.
So, wait, we have a cat interruption. So
Yes,
yes, this is my cat.
Oh, there goes my headphones.
And
There goes the cat.
there goes the cat. We apologize for Catus Interruptus.
Right, where was I?
Dick was taken away immediately and locked up in the coal cellar. Mr. Bumble shortly after took himself off to prepare for his journey. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Mr. Bumble, having exchanged his cocked hat for a round one, and encased his person in a blue greatcoat with a cape to it, and took his place outside of the coach, accompanied by the criminals whose settlement was disputed, with whom, in due course and time, he would arrive in London, he experienced no other crosses on the way than those originated in the perverse behaviour of the two paupers, who persisted in shivering and complaining of the cold, in a manner which Mr. Bumble declared caused his teeth to chatter in his head and made him feel quite uncomfortable, although he had a greatcoat on.
Having disposed of the evil-minded persons of the night, Mr. Bumble sat himself down in the house, at which the coach stopped, and took a temperate dinner of steaks, oyster sauce, and porter, putting a glass of hot gin and water on the chimney piece. He drew his chair to the fire, and with sundry moral reflections on the too prevalent sin of discontent and complaining, composed himself to read the paper. The very first paragraph upon which Mr. Bumble's eyes rested was the following advertisement.
5 guineas reward, whereas a young boy named Oliver Twist absconded or was enticed on Thursday evening last from his home at Pentonville, and has not been seen nor heard of since. The above reward will be paid to any person who can give such information as will lead to the discovery of said Oliver Twist, or tend to throw any light upon his previous history, in which the advertiser is, for many various reasons, warmly interested.
And then followed a full description of Oliver's dress, person, appearance, and disappearance, with the name and address of Mr. Brownlow, at full length.
Mr. Bumble opened his eyes, read the advertisement, and slowly and carefully, several times.
So either he read it 3 times very thoroughly, or he read it 21 times.
We're not sure which. And then, in something more than 5 minutes, he was on his way to Pentonville, actually having, in his excitement, left the glass of hot gin and water untasted.
Is Mr. Brownlow at home?
Inquired Mr. Bumble of the girl who opened the door.
To this inquiry, the girl returned the not uncommon but rather evasive reply of, I don't
know. Where do you come from?
Mr. Bumble no sooner uttered Oliver's name in explanation of his errand than Mrs. Bedwin, who had been listening to at the parlour door, hastened into the passage in a breathless state.
Come in,
said the old lady.
I knew we should hear of him. Poor dear, I knew we should. I was certain of it. Bless his heart. I said so all along.
Having said this, the worthy old lady hurried back into the parlour again, and seated herself on a sofa, bursting into tears. The girl, who not quite so susceptible, had run upstairs meanwhile, and now returned with a request that Mr. Bumble would follow her immediately, which he did.
He was shown into the little back study where sat Mr. Brownlow and his friend, Mr. Grimwig, with decanters and glasses before them. The latter gentleman at once burst into exclamation.
A beetle! A parish beetle! I'll eat my head!
Pray don't interrupt just now.
Said Mr. Brownslow.
Take a seat, will you?
Mr. Bumble sat himself down, quite confounded by the oddity of Mr. Grimwig's manner. Mr. Brownlow moved the lamp so to obtain an uninterrupted view of the beetle's countenance, and said with a little impatience,
Now, sir, you come in consequence of having seen the advertisement?
Yes, sir.
Said the beetle.
And you are a beetle, are you not?
Inquired Mr. Grimwig.
I'm a parochial beetle, gentlemen.
Rejoined Mr. Bumble proudly.
Of course.
Observed Mr. Grimwig, aside to his friend.
I knew he was a beetle all over.
Mr. Brownlow gently shook his head to impose silence on his friend and resumed.
Do you know where the poor boy is now?
No more than nobody.
Replied Mr. Bumble.
Well, what do you know of him?
Inquired the old gentleman.
Speak out, my friend, if you have anything to say. What do you know of him?
You don't happen to know any good of him, do you?
Said Mr. Grimwig caustically, after an attentive perusal of Mr. Bumble's features. Mr. Bumble, catching the inquiry very quickly, shook his head with a portentous solemnity.
You see,
said Mr. Grimwig, looking triumphantly at Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Brownlow looked apprehensively at Mr. Bumble's pursed-up countenance, and requested him to communicate what he knew regarding Oliver in as few words as possible.
Mr. Bumble put down his hat, unbuttoned his coat, folded his arms, inclined his head in a retrospective manner, and after a few moments' reflection, commenced his story.
It would be tedious if given in the beetle's words, occupying as it did some 20 minutes in the telling, but the sum and substance of it was that Oliver was a foundling, born of low and vicious parents, that he, from his birth, displayed no better qualities than treachery, ingratitude, and malice, and had terminated his brief career in the place of his birth by making a sanguinary and cowardly attack on an unoffending lad, and running away in the night time from his master's house. In proof of his really being the person he represented himself, Mr. Bumble laid upon the table the papers which he had brought to town. Folding his arms again, he awaited Mr. Brownlow's observations.
I fear it is all too true,
said the old gentleman sorrowfully after looking over the papers.
This is not much for your intelligence, but I would gladly have given you treble the money if it had been favourable to the boy.
It was not at all improbable that if Mr. Bumble had been possessed of this information at an earlier period of the interview, he might have imparted a very different colouring to his little history. It was too late to do so now, however. He shook his head gravely, and pocketing the 5 guineas, he withdrew.
Mr. Brownlow paced the room to and fro for some minutes, evidently so much disturbed by the beetle's tale that even Mr. Grimwig forbore to vex him further. At length he stopped and rang the bell violently.
Mrs. Bedwin,
said Mr. Brownslow, when the housekeeper appeared.
The boy Oliver is an impostor.
It can't be, sir. It cannot be,
said the old lady energetically.
I tell you he is,
retorted the old gentleman.
What do you mean he is? He can't be. We have just heard a full account. We have just heard a full account of him from his birth, and he has been a thorough-paced little villain all of his life.
I will never believe it, sir. Never.
Replied the old lady firmly.
Never.
You old women never believe anything but quack doctors and lying storybooks,
growled Mr. Grimwig.
I knew it all along. Why didn't you take my advice in the beginning? You would if he had had a fever, I suppose, eh? He was interesting, wasn't he? Interesting! Bah!
Mr. Grimwig poked the fire with a flourish. He was a dear, grateful, gentle child, sir, retorted Mrs. Bedwin indignantly. I know what children are, sir, and having done these 40 years, people who can't say the same shouldn't say anything about them, and that's my opinion. This was a hard hit at Mr. Grimwig, who was a bachelor, as it extorted nothing from the gentleman but a smile. The old lady tossed her head and smoothed
down her apron preparatory to another speech when she was stopped by Mr. Brownsell.
"Silence!"
said the old gentleman, feigning an anger he was far from feeling.
"Never let me hear the boy's name again. I rang to tell you. Never. Never on any pretence, mind. You may leave the room, Mrs. Bedwin, and remember, I am in earnest."
There were sad hearts at Mr. Brownlow's that night.
Oliver's heart sank within him when he thought of his good, kind friends. It was well for him that he could not know what they had heard, or he might have broken outright.
Chapter 18.
Chapter 18. How Oliver passed his time in the improving society of his reputable friends.
About noon next day, when the Dodger and Master Bates had gone out to peruse their customary avocations, Mr. Fagin took the opportunity of reading Oliver a long lecture on the crying sin of ingratitude, of which he clearly demonstrated he had been guilty to no ordinary extent, in wilfully absenting himself from the society of which his anxious friends, and still more in endeavouring to escape from them after so much trouble and expense had been incurred in his recovery. Mr. Fagin laid great stresses on the fact of his having taken Oliver in and cherishing him when, without his timely aid, he might have perished with hunger, and he related the dismal and affecting history of a young lad whom, in his philanthropy, he had succoured under parallel circumstances, but who, proving unworthy of his confidence and evincing a desire to communicate with the police, had unfortunately come to be hanged at the Old Bailey. One morning Mr. Fagin did not seek to conceal his share in the catastrophe, but lamented with tears in his eyes
the wrong-headed and treacherous behaviour of the young person in question that had rendered it necessary that he should become a victim of certain evidence for the Crown, which, if it were not precisely true, was indispensably necessary for the safety of him, Mr. Fagin, and a few select friends.
Mr. Fagin concluded by drawing a rather disagreeable picture from the discomforts of hanging, and with the great friendlessness and politeness of manner, expressed his anxious hopes that he might never be obliged to submit Oliver Twist to that unpleasant operation.
Little Oliver's blood ran cold as he listened to the Jew's words, and imperfectly comprehended the dark threats conveyed in them. That it was possible for even for justice itself to confound the innocent with the guilty when they were accidentally in companionship, he already knew, and that deeply laid plans for the destruction of inconveniently knowing or over-communicative persons had really been devised and carried out by the old Jew on more than one occasion, and though by no means unlikely when he recollected the general stature of the altercations between the gentleman and Mr. Sykes, which seemed to bear reference to some foregone conspiracy of some kind, he glanced up timidly, and met the Jew's searching look. He felt his face pale and his limbs trembling. Neither were noticed nor unrelished by that very old gentleman.
The Jew smiled hideously, and patting Oliver on the head, said that if he kept himself quiet and applied himself to the business, he saw that they would be very good friends yet. Then, taking his hat and covering himself with the old patchy greatcoat, he went out, locked the room door behind him.
And so Oliver remained all day, and for the greater part of many subsequent days, seeing nobody between early morning and midnight, and left during those long hours to commune with his own thoughts, which, never failing to revert to his kind friends and the opinion they must long ago have formed of him, were sad indeed.
After the lapse of a week or so, the Jew left the room door unlocked, and he was at liberty to wander the house.
It was a very dirty place. The rooms upstairs had been great high wooden chimney pieces with large doors, with panelled walls and cornices to the ceilings, which, although they were black with neglect and dust, were ornamented in various ways, all of which tokens Oliver concluded that a long time ago, before the Jew was born, it had belonged to better people, and it had been perhaps quite a gay and handsome. But for now, it was dismal and dreary to look at.
Spiders had built their webs in the angles of the walls and ceilings. And sometimes when Oliver walked softly into a room, the mice would scamper across the floor and run back terrified to their holes. With these exceptions, there was neither sight nor sound of any living thing. And often, when it grew dark, he was tired of wandering from room to room. He would crouch in the corner of the passage by the street door to be as near living people as he could, and would remain there, listening and counting the hours until the Jew or the boys returned.
In all the rooms, the mouldering shutters were fast closed. The bars which held them were screwed tight into the wood, and the only light which was admitted, stealing its way through the round holes at the top, which made the rooms look more gloomy, and filled them with strange shadows. There was a back garret window with rusty bars outside, which had no shutter, and out of this Oliver often gazed with a melancholy face for hours together. But nothing was to be described from it but a confusion and crowded mass of housetops, blackened chimneys, and gable ends. Sometimes, indeed, a ragged, grisly head might be seen to be peering over the parapet wall of a distant house, but that was quickly withdrawn again, and as the window of Oliver's observatory was nailed down and dimmed with rain and years of smoke, it was as much as he could do to make out the forms of different objects beyond, without making any attempt to be seen or heard, which he had as much chance of being as if he lived inside the ball of St. Paul's Cathedral.
One afternoon, the Dodger and Master Bates being engaged out that evening, the first named young gentleman took it into his head to events some anxiety regarding the decoration of his person, which, to do him justice, was by no means a habitual weakness with him, and with this end and aim, he condescendingly commanded Oliver to assist him with his toilet straight away.
Oliver was but too glad to make himself useful, too happy to have some face, however bad, to look upon, and too desirous to conciliate those about him, when he could do so honestly, to throw objection in the way of this proposal. So he at once expressed his readiness, and kneeling on the floor while the Dodger sat upon the table so that he could take his foot into his lap, he applied him to the process, which Mr. Dawkins designated as japanning his trotter cases, which phrase, rendered into plain English, signifieth cleaning his boots.
Whether it was the sense of freedom and independence which the rational animal may be supposed to feel when he sat on a table in ease attitude, smoking a pipe, swinging one leg carelessly to and fro, and having his boots cleaned all the time, without even the pass of trouble of having to take care of them, or the prospective misery of putting them onto the disturb his reflections, or whether it was the goodness of the tobacco that soothed the feelings of the Dodger, or the mildness of the beer that mollified his thoughts, he was eventually evidently tinctured for the nonce, which...
For the nonce, with a spice of romance and enthusiasm foreign to his general nature, he looked down on Oliver with a thoughtful countenance for a brief space of time, and then raising his head, heaved a gentle sigh, half in abstraction and half to Master Bates.
What a pity! It is he isn't a prig.
Ah,
said Master Charlie Bates.
You don't know what's good for him.
The Dodger sighed again and resumed his pipe, as did Charlie Bates. They both smoked for some seconds in silence.
I don't suppose you even know what a prig is,
said the Dodger mournfully.
That I think I know.
Replied Oliver, looking up.
'Tis that you're one, are you not?
Inquired Oliver, checking himself.
I am.
Replied the Dodger.
I'd scorn to be anything else.
Mr. Dawkins gave his hat in a ferocious cock after delivering this sentiment, and looking at Master Bates as if to denote that he would feel obliged by him saying anything to the contrary.
I am.
Repeated the Dodger.
So's Charlie, so's Fagin, so's Sykes, so's Nancy, so that. So are we all, down to the dog, and he's the dowdiest one of the lot.
Poor dog, what did he ever do? At least given to preaching. Peaching.
Added Charlie Bates.
He wouldn't so much as bark in a witness box for fear of committing himself. No, not if you tied him up in one, left him there without whittles for a fortnight, said the Dodger.
Not a bit of it,
observed Charlie.
He's a rum dog.
Don't
he look fierce at any strange cove that laughs or sings when he's in company?
Pursued the Dodger.
And won't he growl at all when he hears a fiddle playing? And don't he hate other dogs as ain't his breed? Oh no.
He's an out-and-out Christian, said
Charlie.
It's very either rude to the dog or rude to Christians, I can't tell.
This was merely intended as a tribute to the animal's abilities, but it was appropriate remark in another sense, if Master Bates had only known it. For there are a great many ladies and gentlemen claiming to be out-and-out Christians, between whom and Mr. Sykes' dog there exist very strong and singular points of resemblance.
And again, I can't tell if it's insulting the dog or the Christians. I physically can't tell.
I think it's insulting to them both.
Again.
Or it's comparing the Christians to the fact that the dog is vicious.
I don't know. Anyway,
we don't know.
Well,
said the Dodger, recurring to the point from which they had strayed, with a mindfulness of his profession, which influenced all his proceedings.
This hasn't got anything to do with the young green here.
No more has it,
said Charlie.
Why don't you put yourself under Fagin, Oliver?
And make your fortune out of hand.
Added the Dodger with a grin.
And so be able to retire on your own property and do the genteel, as I mean to do in the very next leap year, but for an ever come, and 42nd Tuesday in the Trinity week,
said Charlie Bates.
I don't like it,
rejoined Oliver timidly.
I wish they would let me go. I would rather go.
And Fagin would rather not, rejoined
Charlie.
Oliver knew this too well, but thinking it might be dangerous to express his feelings more openly, he only sighed and went on with his boot claiming.
Go!
Exclaimed the Dodger.
Why weren't your spirit?
Why, where's your spirit?
Why, where's your spirit? Don't you take any pride out of yourself? Wouldn't you go and be dependent on your own, on your friends?
Oh, blow that,
said Master Bates, drawing 2 or 3 silk handkerchiefs from the pocket and tossing them into a cupboard. That's
too mean, that is.
Couldn't have done it. I couldn't do it,
said the Dodger with an air of haughty disgust.
You can leave your friends, though,
said Oliver with half a smile.
And let 'em be punished for what you did.
That,
rejoined the Dodger with a wave of his pipe,
that was all out of consideration for Fagin, 'cause the traps know that we work together, you see, and he might have gotten into trouble if we hadn't made our lucky. That was the move, wasn't it, Charlie? Master Bates nodded assent, and would have spoken, but the recollection of Oliver's flight came so suddenly upon him that the smoke he was inhaling got entangled with a laugh and went up into his head, down into his throat, and brought
on a fit of coughing and stamping about 5 minutes long,
Look here.
said the Dodger, drawing forth a handful of shillings and halfpence.
Here's a jolly life. What's the odds where it comes from? Here, catch hold. There's plenty more where they took that from. You won't you? Oh, you precious flat.
It's naughty, ain't it, Oliver?
Inquired Charlie Bates.
He'll come to be scragging, won't he?
I don't know what that means.
Replied Oliver.
Something in this way, old feller,
said Charlie as he said it. Master Bates caught up an end of his neckerchief and, holding it erect in the air, dropped his head onto his shoulder and jerked a curious sound from his teeth, thereby indicating a lively pantomimic representation of scragging and hanging were one and the same thing.
That's what it means,
said Charlie.
Oh, look how he stares, Jack. I never did see such prime company as that 'ere boy. You'll be the death of me, I know you will.
Master Charlie Bates, having laughed heartily again, resumed his pipe with tears in his eyes.
You've been brought up bad, lad,
said the Dodger, surveying his boots
with much satisfaction when Oliver polished them.
Fagin will make something out of you, though, or you'll be the first ever that he turned out unprofitable. You'd better begin at once, for you'll come to the other trade long before you think of it, and you're the only losing time, Oliver.
Master Bates backed this advice with a sundry moral admonitions of his own, which, being exhausted, he and his friend Mr. Dawkins launched themselves into a glowing description of the numerous pleasures incidental to the life they led, interspersed with a variety of hints to Oliver that the best thing he could do would be to secure Fagin's favour without more delay, and by which means themselves had employed to gain from it.
And always put this in your pipe, Nolly,
said the Dodger as the Jew was heard unlocking the door above.
If you don't take fogels and tickers...
What is the good of talking that way?
Interposed Master Bates.
He don't know what he means.
If you don't take pocket handkerchiefs and watches,
said the Dodger, reducing his conversation to the level of Oliver's capacity,
some other cove will, so that the coves that lose 'em will be all the worse, and you'll be all the worse too. Nobody a half a pot, the better, except the chaps what get 'em, and you have just as good and right to them as they have.
To be sure,
said the Jew, who had entered unseen by Oliver.
It's all lies in a nutshell, my dear. Oh, in a nutshell. Take the Dodger's word for it. Ha ha. He understands the catechism of his trade.
The old man rubbed his hands gleefully together as he corroborated the Dodger's reasoning to these terms, and chuckled with the delight that his pupil's proficiency. The conversation proceeded no further at the time, for the Jew had returned home accompanied by Miss Betsy and the gentleman whom Oliver had never seen before, but was accosted by the Dodger as Tom Chitterling, and who, having lingered on the stairs to exchange a few gallantries with the lady, now made his appearance.
Mr. Chitling was older in years than the Dodger, having perhaps numbered 18 winters, but there was a degree of deference in his deportment towards the young gentleman which seemed to indicate that he himself felt conscious of a slight inferiority on a point of genius and professional acquirements. He had small twinkling eyes, a pock-marked face, and wore a fur cap, a dark corduroy jacket, and a greasy fustian, trousers, and an apron. His wardrobe was, in truth, rather out of repair, but he excused himself to the company by stating that his time was only out an hour before, and that, in consequence of having worn regimentals for the past 6 weeks, he had not been able to bestow any attention on his private clothes. Mr. Chitling added, with the strong remarks of irritation, that the new way of fumigating clothes up yonder was infernal and unconstitutional, for it burnt holes in them, and there was no remedying against the county. The same remark he considered to apply to the regulation mode of cutting hair, which he held to be decidedly unlawful. Mr. Chitling wound up his observations by stating that he had not touched a drop of anything for 42 mortal, long, hard working days, and that he wished he might be busted if he weren't as dry as a lime basket.
The picture on the before page is just the kids and explaining this conversation.
Yeah, there they are.
Before the old Jew comes in.
Yeah. There we are.
Where do you think the gentleman has come from, Oliver?
Yeah. I don't know, sir.
Replied Oliver.
Who's that?
Inquired Tom Chitling, casting a contemptuous look at Oliver.
A young friend of mine, my dear.
Replied the Jew.
He's in luck, then.
Said the young man, with a meaning look at Fagin.
Never mind where I came from, young'un. You'll find your way there soon enough. I'll bet a crown.
At this sally the boys laughed. After some more jokes on the same subject, they exchanged a few short whispers with Fagin, and withdrew after some words apart between the last corner and Fagin. They drew their chairs towards the fire, and the Jew, telling Oliver to come and sit by him, led the conversation to the topics most calculated to interest his
His hearers.
hearers. These were the great advantages of the trade, the proficiencies of the Dodger, the admirability of Charlie Bates, and the liberties of the Jew himself. At length these subjects displayed signs of being thoroughly exhausted. By Mr. Chitling did the same. By the House of Corrections become fatiguing after a week or two. Miss Bessie accordingly withdrew and left the party to their repose.
From this day, Oliver was seldom left alone, but was placed in almost constant communication with two boys, who played the old games with the Jew every day, whether for their own improvement or Oliver's. Mr. Fagin knew best. At other times, the old man would tell them stories of robberies he had committed in his younger days, mixed up with so much that was droll and curious, that Oliver could not help but laughing heartily, in showing that he was amused in spite of all his better feelings.
In short, the wild old Jew had the boy in his toils, and having prepared his mind by solitude and gloom to prefer any society to the companionship of his own sad thoughts in such a dreary place, was now slowly instilling into the soul of the poison which he hoped would blacken it and change its hue forever.
And that's our chapters for today. Thank you so much for joining us, dear readers. Stay safe, be excellent, and we'll see you next time. Bye!